Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk about the garment of a man in Deuteronomy 22:5. Deuteronomy 22:5 gives a commandment that is often regarded as a cross-dressing prohibition. Typically, it's rendered something along the lines of, a woman shall not wear the garment of a man, and a man shall not wear the garment of a woman. And it's often treated in this way as if it is that repetitive structure that shall not wear the garment of. It's just flipped. It's the women and the men flipped depending upon which part of the verse we're talking about. But when we go into the Hebrew, that is not actually what is going on. There are actually different wordings being applied depending on what part of the command we're looking at. And this could have an impact on how we interpret this commandment. So let's go into a very literal translation of the Hebrew and see what it says. Article of master shall not be on woman, and master shall not wrap garment of woman. That abhorrence of Yahuwah, your Elohim, is all of one doing these. So as you can see, this verse does not have that exact same pattern in the wording as a lot of the English translations do. And you're probably going to notice some of this difference in wording, like the use of the word master. Master is the translation I chose for the Hebrew word geber. Gabeer is a somewhat unique term that is used to refer to men. It is fairly obscure as far as the text goes. Usually, whenever we see reference to men or reference to males, we're looking at different words in the Hebrew, different from geber. And in defining geber, I think we should look at both its root verb and the use of the noun otherwise in the text to give us some more background. So let's look at Exodus 17:11 for an example of this. And he shall be, as which Moses shall cause to heave his hand, and Israel shall master, and as which he shall cause to rest his hand, and Amalek shall master. In this verse, we can see an example of the use of the corresponding verb for geber. So we're looking at gabar being used in reference to the Israel and Amalek battle. In this context, we see that whenever Moses' hands were held high, Israel prevailed against Amalek. They were defeating them, they were winning, they were dominating them. And whenever Moses' hands began to fall and they were not held up, then Amalek began to have the mastery. They began to master them, prevail against them, and began to win. There are a few other contexts where we see this verb. For example, in Genesis 7:24, in reference to the flood, and the waters mastered over the land 50 and 100 day. And also we can look at Genesis 49:26. Blessings of your father mastered over blessings of my ones conceiving. So clearly these two examples from Genesis are not being used in the context of a battle or in a military context, but there is a similar connotation to it. The waters rising over the land and dominating over the land or mastering the land, and the blessings that were prevailing over the previous blessings. So there is this idea of dominance and mastery that is associated with this verb. However, we also need to balance this with the awareness that the exact etymology or the use of a corresponding verb, as the case may not carry those implications into the use in a given verse or into the exact meaning of the noun. Because we could look at Adam, of course, being red, or we could look at Zakar being remember, and those words do not carry those meanings every time they're used. So we also need to be conscientious of how the noun is being used. And when looking at the use of the noun geber, we can look at Exodus 10, verse 11. Not so. Go, please the masters, and serve Yahuwah, that her you are one seeking. In this passage, Moses and Aaron were appearing before Pharaoh and demanding that Pharaoh release the Israelites. And one of the initial proposals was that, let us go out into the wilderness and sacrifice. And Pharaoh essentially concedes at this point because of the series of plagues, and he's saying, all right, I'll let you go out into the wilderness, I'll let the masters go. But your women and children, they are not allowed to go, they need to stay here. And of course, this was not agreed to, which resulted in further plague, of course. And in reference to Exodus 12:37, and sons of Israel journeyed as 600,000 footmen, the masters two apart from child. So we can see in these two passages the reference to the adult males being the masters. And in the Exodus 12 passage, it refers to 600,000 footmen, the masters apart from the children. And we can see that this corresponds with the number of the Israelites that were counted in Numbers. Now, the number is not exactly 600,000, but it's pretty close to it. It's 600,000 plus a few extra. Of course, we're dealing with an estimate at this point. So there is this correlation at times with the army, and it says 600,000 footmen. However, we need to be clear that the word geber does not mean soldier. There is simply this correlation here. There is a correlation with the people that are composing the army tend to be geber. They tend to be masters. Let's also look at Numbers 24:3. This is in reference to one of Balaam's prophecies. And he bore his comparison, and he said, utterance of Balaam, son of him, bore, and utterance of the master, genuine of the eye. In this verse, Balaam refers to utterance of the master. And there is not a very clear connotation as to what he is meaning by this, although it is used in this way a few times, and that phrase also appears elsewhere in the Tanakh in a similar way. But there is no obvious military connotation to this. And there's another example I think we should look at in Genesis 16:8. And Hagar, maidservant of Sarai, said, where from this you came, and whither shall you go? And she said, from faces of Sarai, my mistress, I am bolting. In this verse, we see the feminine form of the word geber being applied. Of course, it does have the context of mastery and dominance in this case, because we're talking about the relationship between a master and a servant. So there is the connotation of mastery, there is not the connotation of the military. And so we can see that this word geber, it sometimes has a correlation with a military context, in that it can be used to refer to military-aged men, at least in the masculine form. But it does not always refer to that sort of context. It can refer to other things as well. And that is not necessarily the primary meaning of it either, even though it does have those associations. Now, it is interesting that this is the word that is chosen for this verse, Deuteronomy 22:5. It is a very rarely used word, and in the commands in general, it does not really appear. There are the few incidents that I mentioned in Exodus, but as far as the commands go, Deuteronomy 22:5 is pretty unique. So it would seem that there is a purpose, at least I would assume, in using this term specifically rather than just the normal term used for male like zakar or the term for men like aish. But it's not entirely clear what that is. It's not entirely clear what that distinction being made is. So as we continue to look at this passage, there are some other things I want to draw our attention to. For example, the word articles. Article, in this case, is kili. It is not the same word being used to describe that which is belonging to the woman in this case, the woman's garment. A garment in this case is used normally in that way. There's not some obscure meaning to it otherwise. That is the consistent application of it in reference to people's clothing. Articles, on the other hand, can be a very broad scope of things, and in general it just means objects. For example, we can look at Exodus 11:2. Word please in ears of the people, and they asked man from his associate and woman from her associate articles of silver and articles of gold. Also, let's look at Leviticus 11:32. And all which shall fall on him from them in their death, he shall defile. From all article of wood or cloth or skin or sack. You can see in these passages that the term article is being applied in a very broad sense. We're just talking about different objects being made of different materials. In the first case, gold and silver. And this probably refers to some of the jewelry that is referenced later whenever they made the cast calf later in Exodus. And in Leviticus, we have examples of articles of cloth, articles of wood, skin, and sack. So this term of articles often refers to just objects in general, or it also refers to vessels like bowls, sacks, bags, etc. This is frequently how it is used in the text, especially in reference to the cleanliness laws. Articles of scratch, for example, referring to articles of pottery. So this term has a very broad scope of uses. There are a few other common examples in the Torah, one being in Numbers 3:8, and they shall guard all articles of tent of meeting and guard of sons of Israel, to serve service of the tabernacle. This is another common use of the term kili being applied to the tabernacle. The furnishings of the tabernacle, including the various vessels and various tools that were associated with the tabernacle, are frequently called by this term. It is a term that appears frequently in the construction of the tabernacle passages. So once again, we see it being applied in a very broad sense. There are two other examples that I think are interesting, though. First being in Deuteronomy 1:41. And you girded man articles of his battle, and you caused to accumulate to ascend toward the mountain. Also in Genesis 27:3. And now bear, please, your articles, your sling and your bow, and go forth the field and hunt to me hunted. At times, we do see the term kili applied to weaponry. We do see it applied to weapons and arms and equipment of the military. And also we see in Genesis it's being applied to equipment for hunting, it seems. Now, that being said, as we have seen, this is not the exclusive use of the term. The term is very general in its scope. Whenever we're just looking at the term kili, it literally does just mean article or object. It is very vague. It is true that it is applied at times to weapons and equipment relating to war or relating to hunting, as the case may be, but that is not the exclusive use. What we have in Deuteronomy 22:5 is this reference to articles of master. I would assume that articles of master is some specific set of articles. Now, the thing is that in Deuteronomy 1, we looked at the term or the phrase articles of his war. articles of war is a phrase that is used later in the Tanakh as well. I think it's used a few different times in reference to weapons and military hardware. But that is not the phrase that is used in Deuteronomy 22:5. So as we have seen, we can look at these two different words, geber and kali, and we can see that both of them occasionally have correlations with military contexts. But as we've seen, that is not exclusive. And this phrase of articles of master, we don't have any other examples, at least that I am aware of, where this phrase appears. Now, my personal thinking on it in the past has been that it probably does refer to something like military equipment. But the thing is, I think that the issue is ambiguous enough, and there may not be enough evidence to say that conclusively. And keep in mind that I could have selected a lot more verses where that is not the context that's being used, where that is not the connotation that's being applied to those words. And as you can see, if you look into this issue on your own, these words are used very often in very general senses. So what are these articles? I don't think it's very clear. There are a couple other things I did want to point out about this passage, though. There are some traditional views on the subject that do correspond with that opinion. There is some rabbinic stance on the issue that possibly it does refer to articles of war, it does refer to military equipment. But saying that is just equivalent to me saying that there's someone out there that has the same hypothesis as I do. These rabbinic opinions don't have any inherent authority to them. It's just a possible coincidence that they seem to agree on this issue. And it could be argued that, well, there are certain pagan practices that do reflect this, that maybe a reason behind the command is that it's a prohibition of pagan practices because the Canaanites were involved in certain religious rituals that involved their women donning military equipment like armor and weapons, while the men donned the garments of women. While I do understand that to be the case, and while it does seem that some of the commands are prohibitions on Canaanite practices, this verse does not say that. The text does not actually tell us what the reason for this command is. So to just assume that that's probably the meaning is just a guess, and it would potentially close us off to learning the true meaning in the case that the true meaning was different from that. I did also check into the Septuagint on this passage, and it basically rendered it in a very similar way. The term used instead of articles was, as far as I could tell, equivalent in scope. It can be applied to weapons and military equipment, but it's usually just applied to just generic objects of any sort. And the term used instead of master was a generic term for men. So I think this is an interesting passage, and I do think that there is some distinction being made here with articles of master. There must be some distinction here, some specificity to what that entails. But as far as the evidence that I'm aware of is concerned, I don't think that's entirely clear. I think this issue deserves some more investigation, and maybe you'll be able to find something that I did not notice, or maybe you'll recognize something in the process of looking into it on your own. But I think this hypothesis, it does have some potential, but it is not a conclusive one. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out some of my other videos about other Torah issues, and be sure that you stay in touch so we can continue this discussion. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Shalom.